April 20, 1975. The rain came in waves, drumming against the tin roofs of Addis Ababa like an urgent whisper from the heavens. The air smelled of damp earth and diesel, mixing with the lingering scent of burning wood from distant kitchens. Clouds hung low over the city, their swollen bellies flickering with the threat of thunder. It was the kind of day that made people pull their shawls tighter, moving briskly through the streets, wary of what lay ahead, not just from the sky, but from the shifting tides of power that gripped Ethiopia. Near the city center, rifle fire cracked through the afternoon gloom. Somewhere beyond the veil of rain, government forces closed in on the last pockets of resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Negasi Haile and Captain Debeshu Bayene had led a desperate rebellion, a final act of defiance against the Derg's tightening hold. By evening, the rebellion would be crushed. Arrests would be made, and some of those taken would never be seen again. But inside the thick walls of Gandhi Memorial Hospital, another kind of struggle was taking place, one not of bullets and power, but of life itself. Heiress Desta gritted her teeth, sweat dampening her hair despite the cold draft that seeped through the window cracks. The contractions came in relentless waves, each one stealing her breath. She clenched the sheets, her cries swallowed by the distant echoes of gunfire. Dr. Johannes Worku, his white coat stained with long hours, stood at the foot of the bed, his voice steady despite the chaos beyond the walls. "Push, Arist," he urged. "You're almost there." She gritted her teeth, her body trembling with exhaustion, but she obeyed. Outside, the city raged, bullets, betrayals, shifting regimes. But here, in this dimly lit room, none of that. Here, at this moment, there was only the fragile gasp of new life waiting to take its first breath. And as lightning split the sky over Addis Ababa, I was born. I do not remember that night, of course. But I have carried its weight all my life. I grew up knowing that I entered this world amid chaos, that my first cries blended with the gunfire that marked the end of Bayene's rebellion. My mother told me stories of that night, how she could hear the boots of soldiers running through the streets as she lay helpless in labor, how the rain seemed to be weeping for the city, how Dr. Worku never once let his hands tremble despite knowing that outside these walls, men were dying. I have spent my life piecing together the story of that night, filling in the gaps with what others have told me. Some memories are borrowed, some imagined, but all of them feel like they belong to me. Because they do. The city I was born into was never still, never safe. And I grew up always listening for the echo of the past. Some say a birth is a beginning. For my mother, I was proof that life goes on. But for my country, April 20, 1975, was an ending. My first memory is not of my mother or the sound of rain on a tin roof. It is of my grandparents, a renowned priest and his loyal wife, who took me in as their own. To me, they were my parents. Their voices were the first I recognized, their hands the first to hold me, their love the only one I knew. I grew up in a house filled with prayer. My grandfather, draped in his white robe, his voice deep and steady, recited scripture each morning as incense curled through the dimly lit room. My grandmother moved through the house with quiet grace, her hands never still, kneading dough, lighting candles, pressing a palm to my forehead when I was ill. They never spoke of my real parents, and I never thought to ask. In my world, they were the only parents I needed. I met my real mother and father for the first time when I was 3 years old. It is a memory I can never forget. A woman with tired eyes and a hesitant smile knelt before me, reaching out as if afraid to touch me. A man stood behind her, tall and silent. I did not know them. I did not understand why they looked at me with such longing, such sadness. I clung to my grandmother's robe, confused, as my grandfather cleared his throat and spoke words I did not yet comprehend. That was the day I learned that I belonged to two worlds. One was the quiet, sacred home of my grandparents, where I was safe. The other was the world of my real parents, who had lived through war I would only come to understand much later. Even now, I wonder how different I would have been if I had grown up with them from the start. If my mother had rocked me to sleep instead of my grandmother, if my father had been the one to teach me how to walk. But fate had written a different story for me. And so, my first years were shaped by a priest and his devoted wife, by faith, by silence, by a love that was both simple and profound. And yet, the past is never truly buried. In time, I would come to learn the full story of that night in 1975, the night I was born into a world that was already unraveling. A man driving a white Peugeot 504 came to take me away from my grandparents, claiming he was my father. I had never seen him before, never heard his name spoken in our house. Yet, there he was, standing tall in the yard, his presence unsettling, his voice firm but unfamiliar. I didn't want to go. I clung to my grandmother's shawl, my fingers gripping the fabric as if it could anchor me there forever. But my grandfather had already given his approval. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip gentle but unyielding. "You must go, my child," he said, his voice calm, as if this were a simple matter, as if this stranger were not about to change everything. I looked at him, pleading with my eyes, but he did not waver. So, with no other choice, I stepped forward, my legs feeling heavy, my breath tight in my chest. The Peugeot's door creaked as I opened it. Inside, the red leather seats gleamed under the afternoon sun, their smooth surface reflecting a color that reminded me of blood. The thought unsettled me, but I slid in, my body stiff, my hands folded tightly in my lap. The man started the engine, and as we pulled away from the only home I had ever known, he kept glancing at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes, dark and searching, met mine, and he smiled, a smile that felt forced, like a mask stretched over something unreadable. "You look just like your mother," he said, his voice warm, but it did nothing to ease the knot in my stomach. I said nothing. "I know this is difficult," he continued, his gaze flicking between the road and the mirror, "but you'll understand one day." I turned my head to the window, watching as my grandparents' house faded into the distance. The city stretched out before me, vast and unknowable, filled with streets I had never walked, stories I had never heard. I had no idea where he was taking me. The man honked twice, short and sharp, and after a moment, the gate groaned as it swung open. Beyond it lay a courtyard shaded by a sprawling grapevine, its thick branches weaving together to form a natural ceiling. The heavy scent of ripening fruit filled the air, mixing with the warmth of the late afternoon. The Peugeot rolled to a stop beneath the canopy, and the man turned off the engine. For a moment, silence settled between us, broken only by the ticking of the cooling motor. He stepped out first. I hesitated, gripping the door handle but unable to make myself move. Slowly, I pushed open the door and slid out. The ground beneath my feet was warm and uneven, the packed dirt unfamiliar. I followed him inside. The house was an Italian-built home, constructed during the 4-year occupation and later seized by an insurgency led by Djazmak Kadane, my father's father. The weight of its history hung in the air, unseen but present in the careful details, the high ceilings, the arched doorways, the intricate ironwork on the windows. It was a house built by invaders and reclaimed by those who had fought to take it back. As I sat in the quiet living room, my mind drifted back to my grandfather's house, to the place I had called home for as long as I could remember. I suddenly thought of Gizaw, my dog. I remembered the night the hyenas came, their haunting laughter circling the house, closing in like shadows with teeth. By morning, Gizaw was gone. There was nothing left of him but a few tufts of fur near the fence. The next day, my grandfather had wrapped the house in barbed wire, his hands steady as he twisted the sharp metal into place. I had watched him, standing barefoot in the dust, until curiosity got the better of me. I ran my fingers along the wire, testing it, only to feel the sudden sting of metal slicing my skin. Blood had dripped onto the dry earth, bright and startling. My grandfather had scolded me then, his voice gruff but his touch gentle as he cleaned the wound. I had barely noticed the ache in my hand, the greater pain had been losing Gizaw. I was still lost in those memories when the sound of voices pulled me back. The door creaked open, and in walked a woman and several children. Their presence filled the silent house, but instead of warmth, it brought an uneasy tension. The woman's eyes met mine briefly before she looked away. There was no tenderness in her face, no trace of welcome. She wasn't cold, exactly, but she wasn't kind either. My father stepped forward, his voice measured as he introduced them. "These are your siblings," he said, gesturing toward the children. Then, turning slightly, "And this is your mother." I looked at her again, searching for something, recognition, familiarity, even the slightest sign that she had been waiting for me. But there was nothing. The introductions felt hollow, words exchanged out of obligation rather than connection. The air between us was thick with silence. It was awkward, to say the least. My father felt the tension, and the next day, he had organized a family picnic in the grassland of Spada. I was then 3.5 years old. My mother's eyes were heavy on me, like an eagle who had captured its prey. I never expected comfort or acceptance from her, but I had noticed that she was a predator. There was something in the way she watched me, always from the corner of her eye, like a hunter waiting for her prey to falter. Her gaze wasn't one of love or care, but of calculation, measuring my every movement, anticipating my mistakes. Her silence, always so heavy, seemed to be a form of control, a way to keep me at a distance, to remind me that I was never truly safe, never truly her child in the way I longed to be. She wasn't cruel, not in an overt way, but her detachment was suffocating. It was as if she knew that by withholding affection, by keeping me constantly off balance, she could shape me, mold me into something more obedient, more distant, more like her. I would watch her sometimes when she thought I wasn't looking, her eyes narrowing, her lips tight in a way that made her look like a predator studying her next move. There was no softness, no warmth in her expression. Just an unspoken understanding that, in her world, love was not given freely. It was earned, or maybe even extracted. In those moments, I felt like prey. The kind that couldn't run, couldn't escape, because her presence alone was enough to trap me. And though I never expected her to hold me close, there was a strange, dark satisfaction in knowing she could control the very air I breathed, without ever lifting a finger. For a long time, I thought I wasn't human enough because I didn't love my mother. A mother is supposed to be loved, cherished, and honored. That's what I was told, that's what I believed, because in our country, Ethiopia, we even refer to her as Mother Ethiopia. It's ingrained in us from the start, this deep, sacred reverence for the maternal figure, not just in our families but in the very fabric of our identity. People would say, "The man who despises his mother is subhuman," a phrase that haunted me in my youth.